Thanks, Barb. So we're going to delve into the exciting and interesting world of native edible plants today. And just so you know, this particular slide at the front is going to be covered later in the presentation. That's actually some white aspen fruit that we're growing in a pot in my garden in suburban Melbourne, northern suburbs. So they're a bit of a rainforest plant, but they turned out to be a lot easier to grow than expected. Just first of all, before we start, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional knowledge that is out there. And I'm currently not even living in the northern suburbs of Melbourne at the moment because I'm helping care for my parents. So I'm living on Yorta land, and I'd really like to acknowledge their thousands of years of caring for the country. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and also the emerging leaders and their connection to the land and the water, which up there is a lot of rivers, and the community. And they're still very much very active up in that area. So it's been really interesting to work with people up there, and I really enjoy it. So I'd just like to explain the focus of today. So this is more an emphasis, and I know that people could be coming from anywhere with a Zoom workshop, but this is really based around bushfood gardens that are able to be planted in the Melbourne area. So just to mention that native Australian edible plants have many benefits, and so they are, if you're using local Indigenous plants, they're completely suitable because they've evolved that way to grow in the particular soil you have, if your soil hasn't been too disturbed or altered. They're suitable for the environment, although of course, again, the environment is changing so much with climate change, but in general, there is that initial suitability. And also they very importantly can create habitat for wildlife. And I was lucky to attend a really good workshop last week online about native pollinator insects, and that was really fantastic for me to kind of tie in more of the insect knowledge with my plant knowledge that I had, and learn some new little tricks and interesting things as well, and just how to really I hope that the information I've learned will help to enrich when I'm teaching. So I was really happy to be able to attend that. So yeah, wildlife is they need all sorts of things. They need tiny little flowers, they need all sorts of things to sustain them. And of course there's the whole cycle of life where the smallest insect may be sustaining tiny birds, and so on and so forth. So they're all part of the whole interrelated environment that we're living in. And it's really easy to think in an urban environment that these are just the gardens out there, or that everything's very separate, but the overall environment in Melbourne is still linked, and often it's linked purposely through wildlife corridors, but native edible plants can also form part of that. So this class, as I said, is going to particularly focus on plants for growing in Melbourne because that's where the class is based, and also covering in the first instance some local Indigenous plants to your area, in the area of Knox and Yarra ranges, and also mentioning those that grow in pots and a general urban environment. And I've been testing these out in my northern suburbs, Pascoe Vale South home garden over the last 12 years or so. And we might touch on, but we're not specifically focusing on First Nations use of plants. And there's a little bit of foraging and wild. Speaking of wild, there's my neighbour, I'm running this at my neighbour's place today, and her cat's decided to pay a visit, so the cat may come across the screen any second. That is a little photo of me harvesting or foraging on some coastal currants, and I'll mention those later in the presentation as well. But it's always good to go out into the bush or coastal areas to see plants and learn about them. And if you are doing that, my view on foraging is just taste, but don't take away a whole lot, because it's really needed for wildlife, because our native or our natural landscape, I should say, has been so seriously degraded that the wildlife that is there needs every little bit of it. So don't take large amounts, please, when you just taste, so that you know what that plant is, if you 100% know what it is. But as we're not focusing on foraging, but I just thought I'd mention that. So first of all, I'll start with a beautiful plant that is great for a sensory garden. So This plant generally gets called river mint, but I like to call it native mint because its botanical name, and anyone who's not familiar with botanical name, that's like the scientific name. And it's usually in at italics, as you see there, or if it's not in italics, it's in regular print with an underline. So if you see plant names with underlines, you may think, oh, they're trying to emphasize that plant name, but in actual fact, it's just indicating that it's the scientific name of the plant. So because it's Mentha australis, I like to think of it as, well, that's the Australian mint, so that's native mint. There's a lot of common names that overlap with each other, and that can get really tricky. So you'll see another plant in a minute that has a common name of native mint or mint bush. So be really careful with common names when you're ordering plants or when you're sourcing plants or identifying them. And that's why it's very important to get a grip on the botanical name if you can. So this little plant you may see around the place, Now, one thing to note is that it varies all over Melbourne and Victoria, or Victoria and indeed Melbourne. And I've had at different times in my garden up to 4 different, quite different native mints growing in my garden that had quite a different scent and a different growth habit. So, and they're all still Mentha australis. So generally speaking, it's about 30 centimetres high, and it's spreading. It doesn't spread as vigorously as the European or just regular garden mint, but it is. Sorry, I'm having issues with this cat here. This cat, off you go. Cat's very excited to see me. Hasn't seen me for a long time. So it's a deciduous plant, and it can spread with. If it gets a lot of moisture, it can spread as much as garden mint. But I don't find it spreads as vigorously if it's not given much moisture. And in fact, some of the better versions of this plant I've seen growing on nature strip or verge gardens. So it does actually prefer full sun. And I find that when I've grown it in semi-shade, it gets some white powderiness on the leaves, and that's powdery mildew. So I don't actually like to grow it in semi-shade if possible. I like to grow it in full sun because then it's disease-free. If you can grow a plant in a way that it's not going to get diseased and doesn't need treatment or extra care, why wouldn't you do that? It is relatively drought tolerant once you get it established. So a lot of drought tolerant plants are not drought tolerant in their own sake. They need, or from the get-go. So you take them from a nursery and you plant them in your garden, and you can't just not water them. They really need to be, gradually weaned off the regular watering that happens in a nursery. So bear that in mind every time you see something that says drought tolerant. So I do like to specify once established, being that my highest qualification is in nursery production and management. Now, speaking of managing plants, this plant is deciduous in winter like other mints, but if your plant is quite young and you cut it to ground level in winter, you will find that your plant may die, as I found. So try to just cut the plant back by half in winter. If your plant is really vigorous and you end up with a big clump of it, 50 centimetres wide, then you can definitely cut it down to ground level at that point. But otherwise, be a little bit careful. Like all soft leaf herbs, and with harvesting with herbs, you really do need to know your plants and know when they like to be harvested. And these have very soft leaves, and so you harvest them, anytime before winter. Because they're deciduous in winter, you're going to prune them back anyway. I find that you've got healthier growth this time of year or coming up a little bit further in the year. So just before Christmas, I like to harvest a lot of my mint type plants because they've got their freshest growth and they haven't developed any fungal diseases. You can use the fresh leaves to make a fantastic tea, a really spectacular tea, which is really good hot or cold. You can put it into chocolate cake. I find in chocolate cake or any sort of chocolate cooking, when we've experimented with that, it does serve better being dried first. So that kind of tends to intensify the flavour, and you can use the leaves dried that way. I may have to actually just stop for a moment and dispense with this cat because it started to try and bite me. Sorry, cat issues. Apologies, everybody. That cat was really was fighting with me. Sorry. Oh, sorry. That's all right. Sorry about that. So If the fresh leaves are, because they're so delicate, the leaves are best not tossed through salads or fruit salads, but they're good in the savoury or the sweet salads, like, you know, with tomatoes and cucumber, they go really well, but you can also put them with fruit salad. So just be really delicate with them. So native thyme, as I said, there's other things that get called native mint. This sometimes gets called native mint or mint bush, is more of a gardening term for this plant. So if you go to a nursery and ask for mint bush, this is the kind of plant you'd get. Now, there are different species of Prostantheras, and there's only really 2 that are the most suitable for eating because the rest have really high levels of menthol. So rotundifolia is also native to the eastern outer suburbs of Melbourne, so in a general sense. So that's something that you can look for, that's a plant that's native to your area, so it'll cope with your conditions. It does grow in a pot quite well. It's, if you're familiar with Prostantheras, very quick growing, and so that's why I've mentioned prune regularly to keep bushy. So prune it after it flowers, like most pruning that you do. It does like shade and moisture, so it is definitely suited to those outer towards Yarra Ranges type of conditions, more so than the dry belt of the northern suburbs of Melbourne. It has really, really complex flavours, where it gets its name native thyme. You do see this plant sometimes labelled as all sorts of other things too, so that's really just a bush food industry name or a native food industry name. The ways that I've used it have been with eggplant. It also goes well with red meat. You can use the leaves fresh or dried. One of my favourite ways of using it, even though I no longer eat butter, but I used to chop up the fresh leaves and put it through slightly room temperature butter, or just slightly softened, I should say, and then put it back in the fridge. And it was a really good way to experience the flavour. And you could then melt that butter over vegetables, over pasta, or over red meat if you eat red meat. But it is such a strong flavour, and that's why it goes well with eggplant too. So appleberry is another plant you'll see out on your side of town, and it's a really delicate little plant. If it's left to be in an open position, it will form itself into a sprawling, kind of tangled up shrub that is maybe 1.5 metre wide. It might get to 1.5, oh sorry, it doesn't climb to 1.5 high. In that situation, just sprawls, and it's maybe then only a mounding shrub to 30 or 40 centimetres high at the most, and it just spreads out sideways. But if it's anywhere near a plant, another taller tree, it will, given half a chance, climb, and it gets to approximately 1.5 metres high. But I have seen some out at the Toolangi State Forest that were maybe 4 metres or 5 metres long, that had gone up and twined around and around and around a tree trunk and then out, and were hanging over the road, and the fruit was hanging out over the road, which was really interesting. So it does like part shade. It can cope with full sun, but it likes a lot of moisture. And the fruit ripens in February. It's a funny, seedy little fruit. Don't forget that these fruits are wild, and so they haven't been altered by years and years of cultivation and breeding. And so pretty much all the food you eat every day from beginning to end is from plants that have been selected and bred and crossed and cultivated. They've been in cultivation for sometimes hundreds of years, and so the old varieties have all but disappeared in cultivation now. And so that's why, in general, and you may have touched on this in some of the other Gardens for Harvest classes, you may have touched on heirloom seeds, heirloom vegetable seeds, and they're so important because they do contain that genetic diversity that we're losing worldwide generally. So these plants are still in their pure form, and so it makes them really high in nutritional value, but it does mean that they don't taste like you're used to tasting from the supermarket or greengrocer or the market. So that's a little introduction to appleberry, which is a bit of fun. And that's the little flowers down the bottom there. You can see they're really beautiful little flowers. You may see also that it resembles a weed in your area, Solia heterophylla. And I'm not a botanist, but I believe it might be in the same family, not genus or species. And as I said, I'm not a botanist, but I'm pretty sure that it is, I think it's some way related. but it's not a weed. So now this is something that can be slightly weedy. It can spread quite easily. And so this is a plant that you don't tend to buy. It tends to pop up in your garden naturally. So it's an evergreen. It can get quite tall. I mean, I have seen them higher than 2 meters even. And I have seen I've seen one at a friend's garden in Northcote, and I think they said they've had it more than 10 years, but that is really, really unusual. They can be quite short-lived. So they kind of grow quickly and people say, oh, what's that in my garden? That's really interesting. The main thing to bear in mind is that you must wait till the fruit is fully orange or red, like that picture down the bottom there. It's a Solanaceae, as you can see from the genus name, Solanum. And I mean, even green tomatoes, like commercially grown tomatoes that we eat, are poisonous when they're green, and they're only safe to eat if they're cooked or pickled, made into chutney or pickles. So they're not safe to eat when they're green. So no Solanaceae is, but this, just because this is an interesting plant that may just pop up by itself, so you can learn to be aware of it and learn to look for it. And if you do, if you get one dropped into your garden by nature, that's great. You can appreciate it and enjoy it for what it is. So yeah, quite interesting plant, quite striking, as you can see. But the general look of it is that it can be just a lot of really dark green and very dark and even burgundy kind of stems and leaves. Stems and trunk. But when it has the fruit on it and the flowers, it's a very ornamental plant. So that's something interesting to look out for. The other thing is, I believe it's the fruit, and it's the basis of, just a little fun fact of plants, it's the basis of the modern contraceptive pill. So the natural hormones that are in this plant replicate what I think the hormones that women have when they're pregnant, and so tricks the body into thinking that it's pregnant, and so you don't ovulate. So yeah, a bit of interesting, fun plant facts there. So many of the modern drugs that are out there in pharmaceutical land did have their origins in the plant world. So this one is around in a reasonable amount of Melbourne, and I'm not, without looking it up, and I didn't get a chance to look it up, 100% sure if it's in the Yarra Ranges, but it's in the outer suburbs. It's in a lot of Melbourne, or it would have been many, many years ago. So you will find it at Indigenous nurseries. And this is my favourite saltbush for berries. So you can see the size of the fruit there. I mean, we don't have a hand next to it, but let's say the fruits wouldn't get any bigger than a little fingernail. So sometimes they're that round, and then they're slightly flatter too. Interestingly, they can be pink, red or orange when they're ripe. So this one's tended towards the more orangey red colours, and this also has a slightly grey foliage, and you will get slightly green and other ones that are more grey foliage in these saltbushes. There's lots of variation, and with the variation also comes the fruit, so that you get this hot pink colour, which is really quite interesting. And the one in my garden's actually hot pink. That's one I found in the bush, actually. Oh no, sorry, that's one at in the gardens at Melbourne Zoo. And in the bush, I've seen them growing right at the base of really big gum trees, like this landscaper has placed them at the zoo or outside the zoo. And I tried to grow them in my garden at the base of another big tree, but it was an evergreen tree, I mean, still an evergreen tree, and it hasn't been that successful. And the reason being because eucalypts or gum trees generally have, or quite often have, a very open canopy, and so there's lots of light getting through. And so that's the difference. So they don't mind the dryness of being right next to a big tree, like the competition for moisture, but they do need to get some light. And so the one in my garden in Melbourne that I've grown, because I ran out of spaces to try growing this plant, it grows very flat because it's just reaching out to the sun all the time, whereas they should be, you know, growing up to 50, 60 centimetres high and be quite a tall bush. Like everything, you prune after flowering and fruiting because you want to save the fruit. But they are the easiest of the berries to pick because they're a reasonable size. And like all saltbush berries, they are salty and sweet, which is kind of fun, which means that they, like the native mint bush, like the native mint, they blend into fruit salads, or they can also blend with salads, like with tomato, cucumber, lettuce type salads. So you can throw them over the top as a garnish if you only have a few, or you can mix them through because they're really sturdy. So they will cope with being mixed through the salad. But if you want to emphasize them because you've only got a few, then put them over the top as a bit of a garnish. There's a company in South Australia that makes ruby saltbush cordial. That's a really, really delicious tasting cordial. So you could look out for that online. I think I got it through the Port Augusta, through the Arid Lands Botanic Gardens at Port Augusta, through their gift shop. So I think I ordered it through them. They're also just really good as a little garden snack. So this is a great plant to put in a school bush food garden because the kids can just pick them and eat them. So that's a really good plant to try getting your hands on. They're super easy to grow. I don't think any of the saltbushes do that well in pots, so this one I wouldn't bother trying to grow in a pot. So we'll cover another couple of ground cover saltbushes, which can be quite devilishly difficult to tell apart. And I often have to refer to notes to remember which one's which. So you've got Atriplex semi-baccata, and if I flick over, you've got Chenopodium nutans, also called Inata nutans. So one is nodding saltbush and one is creeping saltbush. The use of them is just the same essentially. So you can take tiny little matchstick size, or even smaller than matchsticks size berries, and they're salty and sweet. They're red when they're ripe. They fall off really easily, so you can try putting a bowl underneath the branches and let them, just brush it and let them fall in. And someone did tell me years ago that she likes to just run her hand along a branch to gently dislodge some. So, and that can be a good way of getting large quantities, because if you're picking each individual one, you're going to go slightly spare. So yeah, it's quite a lot of work to harvest each berry. So you need a quicker harvesting method. But you can also just snack on one or two in the garden, which is really nice. And that, again, this is a really nice thing for bush food gardens for schools, because children will really enjoy that challenge of just trying to pick out just a couple of little berries, and they'll really cherish that. So these are lovely home foraging plants. So again, that's a different take on foraging that I like to suggest to people is, look, yes, you can see them out in the wild, but why not grow them in your garden or school garden or in your community garden as well? And then you're able to enjoy them without taking them from the bush. And very, very similarly, you've got the nodding saltbush, and the way to distinguish this is that the leaves have a distinct arrowhead shape, and you can kind of just see the point of them there. So that's how you know that that's nodding saltbush, unless you're a botanist and you're going to more lengths to understand it. But for the basic gardener, which I'd include myself in that way, then nodding saltbush, arrowhead leaf shape. So again, it's a drought tolerant plant. This is actually taken at my parents' place, this photo, so you can see the colour of their red soil, and it just pops up all over the place, as does a version of the ruby saltbush too. Again, all the same ways of using the fruit and the same way of harvesting them. They have a slightly different taste, but in essence, it's the same kind of plant as far as a bush food garden goes. And these, of course, make really good ground covers to be a living mulch in your garden, and you can just pop them in your garden here and there. You get really good value out of them. They don't need a lot of care, and they're easy to grow ground covers that are going to keep moisture in your soil and help to suppress some weeds, not all obviously, and have another use as well. So, and there's quite a lot of birds that will enjoy nibbling on those berries. And when you've got really nice ground covers like that, you'll find that small lizards also enjoy living underneath those in the cool, or, just sheltering from predator birds and potentially cats too. So, these have got many, many uses, these plants. As I said, really, really hardy. Now, here's one you might know from walking through the bush in your area. So, Coprosma quadrifida, or the prickly currant bush. This is, funnily enough, one that I've just never managed to grow in my garden, and it's mainly because I ran out of space by the time I thought about growing this one. and I can't see any reason why it wouldn't grow. I mean, I've planted it in lots of Indigenous gardens for groups and schools and things, and I can't see any reason why it wouldn't fruit really readily. And I don't know if it grows in a pot, and that is an experiment I should really carry out. So there you go. There's a bushfood challenge for you. Try to grow it in a pot and see what it does. And often you'll find that if the plant likes growing in the pot, that it may grow bigger and better fruits, but they just may not be quite as high in nutrition as the ones that have survived in the wild. And that's part of why the nutrition levels are so high, because the plant's putting out lots of what we call antioxidants in the, search for superfoods in our lives, that plants just call plant chemicals to protect them. And that's what they're about. It does grow, as you have no doubt found out, if you find it in the bush, it does grow in shade. And the fruits won't be ready until January to March, and you can pick them off the bush or use them in cooking. But again, if you're going to do that, I'd really suggest that you try to not harvest from the wild, to grow your own. And of course, it's a fantastic bird habitat. The birds can eat the fruit, and also they're protected from other predators because it's a nice prickly bush. So this is a really good plant all over. Now, another berry producing plant, which is definitely edible. I've had a lot of discussions with people about the validity of whether this is edible or not. And the main Indigenous nursery that I've bought from over the years has been VINC, or Victorian Indigenous Nurseries Cooperative in Fairfield. And I've become quite good friends over the years with the staff there. And I asked them which Dianella they found to have the tastiest berries, and these are this is their recommendation. And so Dianella laevis or Dianella admixta. So these are really good landscape plants, and lots of landscapers use them. Why they're used? Because they're so hardy in the environment. But just be wary about, if we're wanting to eat them, be wary about which one you've actually got, because Dianella tasmanica, for instance, is definitely not edible. It's really not tasty. And, excuse me, hay fever time of the year, sorry. So yeah, if you are wanting it specifically for planting in a bushfood garden, and those ones on the left, you can see the kangaroo apple in the background, and you can see the, oh no, actually that's coastal wattle, sorry, coastal wattle. Dianella's, that was planted at a school for the kids to forage from, so I was careful about choosing particular species. So if you're finding them in the bush, eat carefully, I suppose, but definitely avoid Tasmanica if you find that in a garden anywhere. They are good habitat for birds and lizards. They don't mind full sun if they get good watering. They always fruit better when there's been good rain, or good watering. So this is a really good year to go out and look for them anywhere really. And these can be a really good urban foraging plant if you can identify them properly and you know what you're actually getting. As I said, they're going to fruit really well in this in this time of year. This year, because we've had so much rain. That's a really hardy plant. So from what I've read, these were not widely used by very many Indigenous people. So some parts of Australia, First Nations ate these plants and ate the fruit, I should say, and other areas did not. And as I said, definitely not Dianella tasmanica. So, but there is literature supporting the fact that these are edible, and they're not poisonous, they're definitely edible. And they have a texture a lot like a lily-pilly fruit. So they're kind of, or a syzygian one at least, so they're kind of crunchy and spongy. They're really quite interesting. But that bright blue is just a spectacular weird thing to use as a garnish or anywhere you want to show it up in your kitchen. And I thought I'd go from one strappy plant to another. So Lomandra longifolia or longifolia is a really hardy plant, and if you're really stuck for something to plant in a bushfood garden or in a school or in your home garden, this is something you can just about guarantee it's going to live. It survives in quite wet conditions once it's got established. It can tolerate quite a lot of moisture. It can tolerate quite a lot of dry conditions once established. It grows in dense shade, it grows in full sun. So a bit like the Dianella, this is a very widely used landscape plant. I'd say more than Dinella. This is a very, well, there's various varieties or different varieties of Lomandra and Dinella, different hybrids that people are using with, bluer leaves and finer leaves, smaller leaves, broader leaves, all sorts of things. So many variations in those two plants, but the basic Lomandra longifolia is still a really useful and lovely plant. So they're flowering at the moment, and the flowers are quite prickly, so you have to be careful when you put your nose near them, but they kind of give out a beautiful sweet scent in the air around them. So they are really lovely in that way. But if you're concerned for preschoolers or school children, you can just take off the flower stems as they occur, because they don't flower a lot. So I'd only just read recently, and I didn't know that before, that the flowers, because I haven't tried that flowers can be soaked in water for their nectar. So you could try that out. Oh, and there's a slight little bit of typo there with 2 points. The bottom 2 points are really meant to be 1. That the seeds can be ground into flour. Now, I also did read, I think I read that same soaking in water in the same article. I knew that the seeds could be ground into flour, but I didn't know that you needed a male and a female plant for the seeds to be produced, I beg your pardon. So I thought I had seen Dinella seeds occurring with only one plant, but I mean, also you do get pollination of flowers when occurring at times in less than ideal conditions. I mean, it can happen with European plants as well, even when it's not meant to happen that way. It sometimes can, and I'm not exactly sure how that happens. So in other words, you're best to have a group of these plants if you're really keen on getting some of the seeds. And as I said, you don't get many flowers, so you're not going to get that many seeds. So you need to grow a big group of these plants, probably up to 10 or 12 if you want to harvest significant amounts of seeds, so that you're getting a blend of female and male plants, and you can hopefully guarantee you're going to get some seed. They are really good plants to also use as a natural obstruction in the garden to keep dogs out of an area. I mean, that's why I planted them in my garden originally, because I had 2 really boisterous dogs, and they worked quite well. So they're just a barrier that the dogs struggled to get through, depending on how big your dogs are. The interesting thing too is that the leaf bases are edible. So if you find a really young leaf and you kind of put your hand in, which can be tricky because even the leaf edges can cut you, you can just pluck that out and you can chew on the soft, young, green, white part of the leaves, and they taste like peas or like young peas. So it's a really sweet flavour. And you can understand when you find out what the plant family is. Oh, now I've completely forgotten the name of the family. It's the same family as European asparagus. So that's one reason it makes sense that this plant has edible aspects to it. It's not always the case when you're learning that, but knowing the families of plants can be really beneficial. Oh, whoops, sorry. And you can predict a lot about how that plant can be used. So I think we've covered most of that. Oh yeah, that's the other important thing I wanted to say. So Lomandra longifolia is also a really well-known weaving plant. So if you're a home weaver or you like to do some weaving, this is a fantastic plant to try out, and it does need a bit of pruning at times if you've got it near a pathway like I have. So you'll always have lots of material for weaving. It's one of those leaves that needs to kind of dry out and then be re-soaked or split. But you'll find things online about how to work with that. And I'm not even the most basic of weavers. I'm behind that even. so you can't ask me about that. I'm sorry. But there's heaps of people. I think there's someone out your way that teaches weaving classes. So there's some great stuff out there. So we'll get into some of the native edible flowers. And edible flowers have become a really popular thing. And so I thought it would be really good to include some of the native edible flowers. Now, there's many different species of, and even some varieties of Wallenbergia, which is the native bluebell. Also gets called the tufted bluebell. So if you're not looking to plant, or if you're not fussed about planting an Indigenous one and you just want it Indigenous to your area specifically, and you just want a reliable Wallenbergia to get as many flowers as possible, then I can recommend Wallenbergia communis. And again, I got that information from the good people at VINC, who were really helpful when I said, look, you know, if I want to put one in the school landscape, this is years ago, and I need it to flower really well. And also Wallenbergias can be a little bit weak when they die back in winter and they don't look so great, and they can be forgotten and, you know, stepped on, and, you know, they're not looking their strongest as they are in photos like this when they come back for spring and summer. So that is a good variety to try, sorry, good species to look for. However, it's also good to try to grow ones that are Indigenous to your area. So you'll often find there's, you know, 3 or so that are local to your area. So it can be fun to try them out and see how they go. They do get called grassy plants, and I do struggle a little bit with, well, do you call it a herb? Because it's not really a herb like I would describe. In botanical language, it's a herb, but in gardening, it's a little wildflower, I guess. So they can get up to, you know, 30 to 40 centimetres high. They put on such a boisterous display of flowers when they flower. They're absolutely beautiful. And yet when you touch them, they're really soft and delicate, and the flowers themselves are delicate too, as well as the plant. And you can't believe that these little plants, you know, perform so well in the landscape, I suppose. They're really beautiful things. So they do grow in some shade, but you will get more flowers if you are planting them in the sun. So, you know, something might, it's a bit like the Dianellas with the extra rain or the extra watering. You'll still have your plant growing if you've got a Dianella in the flax lily in the shade without much sun, but you will get a lot more fruit, better flowering and better fruiting, just like any productive plant. You'll get better production with more rain. So again, with the sun versus shade thing, some plants require shade. These native bluebells will tolerate some shade, but you'll get more sun, more flowers in the sun. And it's good to know that little bit of a difference, because otherwise you might inadvertently put your plant in the wrong situation. So in the, you know, sort of late summer, once they finish, they're still flowering even in late summer, they're still flowering, and they start to die back after that. And they usually shoot again and really come up again in spring. So the ones I've got in tubes at home are they're flowering now, they're thickening up, and you can kind of see from the one on the left too, they can be really floppy. So that's something to bear in mind when you're buying them as tube stock from an Indigenous nursery. And you'd never really see these as 6-inch pots or 150ml pots in a nursery. I don't think I've ever seen them for sale that way. These would all be for sale as tube stock from an Indigenous nursery or from a retail nursery that sells Indigenous plants. So I'll just bear that in mind. And a lot of plants that are sold as tube stock don't look that great in the tube, but have faith, put them in the garden and they will spread and be happy. So, and you can encourage them to bush up a little bit by giving them a bit of a haircut in early winter. And then as far as the use of the plant goes, the flowers are very, very delicate. So you can use them as a garnish on salads or fruit salads, or put one individual flower on a little cupcake or any kind of special dessert. And they are so delicate that you, again, like the native mint leaves, you shouldn't really, you know, toss them right through a salad, because they're going to be really messed up by doing that. So they're just so delicate. They also make a fantastic little garden snack, and they don't have a very strong taste, but they are just a nice thing for children to snack on in the garden. And it's lovely to have those kinds of things in your own home garden or in a school garden or community garden, where flowers are there for insects. And also when you're talking about garden snacking, you want something that's producing a lot of flowers, and you're not going to be depriving wildlife or insects, or also you're not you're not waiting for any fruit to form. These are flowers that just produce seed, no fruit, so no edible fruit. So, you know, these are a great edible flower to grow. And I know people have been trying to learn about which native flowers are good for edible uses, and these are one of the best as far as I'm concerned. And there's lots of different species around Melbourne. Now, native violet, there's a couple of nice pictures there of native violets in paving. I've used them for many, many years in landscaping. They can be used as a low traffic lawn, which is a great substitute in a shady area for regular grasses. I mean, you can also use a native grass called Enchylaena stipoides, or weeping grass, but that can be quite expensive to get going. And native violet, or you could have a mixture of native violet and dichondra, they become quite a good lawn. And if you're walking across them, you'll find that those bits are just a little bit more flattened. I've grown it for that reason in really sunny positions over the years, and they flower well, but they do get a bit yellowed out in really intense sun. So then I've tried to grow them in more shade, and the plants grow well, but you just don't get any flowers. So light sun, well, I've said they flower better in a sunny position, but intense late afternoon sun is not really their thing, because they do like some moisture. And they're very shallow rooted. So, and that's how they spread as a little ground cover. They just run along the ground, put down some little roots, they run a little stolon out, and they root down into the ground. But they don't have really deep roots. So therefore they need rich soil with good moisture holding qualities and good levels of organic matter and humus in it. And that's why they're a little forest understory plant, and you'll see them, you know, just wandering about here and there in bushland, but you'll see that they're flowering where there's little pockets of sun coming through. So if you're putting them in your garden and you're wanting them to flower really well, then, as I say, just give them sun, but not late afternoon sun, because I tried that and had big sections of them die out, which is a bit sad. These are great, very high producing, they produce heaps of flowers. If you're wanting to add them to salads, you can add them to fruit salads, use them as a garnish. They stand up quite well to being tossed around in a leafy salad. You can also actually use the native violet leaves in salads as well. And like all salad leaf plants, you go for the younger, fresher leaves. So if you're looking at that bottom picture, there's some leaves that are brighter green, and you'd be picking those ones out. And of course, like any leaves or flowers, you're washing them and, you know, giving them a rinse first before you eat them, because you don't know what's been crawling over them. And you can add those to your salads as well. All Viola, and that's the genus, all violas are edible. So the weedy, or for your side of town, sweet violet or English violet, Viola odorata, is quite weedy out where you are. But a great alternative is to grow this, the native violet. Now, one thing to know too is that the native violets that you buy in a retail nursery are going to be quite different they have a slightly different form than the native violets at an Indigenous nursery. And the Indigenous nurseries, in the tube stock type situation, the leaves are slightly smaller and the flowers are less showy. So if you want big showy flowers to use in a school garden, or to use as a garnish, as a, you know, edible flower use, then I'd suggest that you buy your native violets from a retail nursery, because you're getting a different, you know, I think they actually took the original stock from Northern Australia or New South Wales or Queensland or something, because it's quite a different quite a different look. So they only grow about 10 centimetres high, and they can sometimes grow up and through, they can sometimes climb a little bit and work their way through damp areas on the edges of houses or fences. They can do something like that. But generally they grow horizontally. So a super, super useful plant. You can sometimes find them for sale by the metre. So you can buy, I think it's a place online called Plant Tiles or something like that. And they sell like chunks of these that you can just put down straight away. and have a beautiful native violet cover in your garden, which is really lovely. So yeah, great plant for school gardens, great for a whole range of uses. And as I said, you can eat the leaves as well. And they don't have a really strong taste, just a kind of a greeny taste, so to speak, the leaves, nothing particular. And the flowers are not so much, they're not scented like sweet violet. Now here's something for a bit of urban foraging. There is actually a lily pilly that, now I cannot remember which lily pilly is native to, I think it's to Gippsland, and I don't think it would be around the Yarra Ranges. I think it's more around Gippsland, but I could be corrected there. If there's a botanist in the audience, they'll know, or someone who just has more knowledge than me of that. I tend to just use them in a more of a gardening sense. So, but there is one species that's native to Victoria. So there's two main groups of lily pillies as far as, just for gardening purposes, which are syzygium or Ackmanii. And I like to suggest the syzygiums because they have larger, fleshier, more flavour. I think they have better tasting fruit personally. So they have a lot of different things going on. They're a little bit clove tasting, they're a little bit tart tasting, a bit of sweetness, but they vary enormously. And that's mainly because they're grown, these plants that you see around the place. Well, many of them, especially the street trees, are grown from seed usually. And so the plants that you're buying for hedging for your home garden are tending to be more bred varieties, like for instance, resilience, it's mentioned on the third point there. And what that plant's resilient to is psyllids, which is PSY, I don't think I've got that written there, PSYLLID, which are a horrible, nasty little insect that gets into the underside of the leaf and makes a home in it. And so it causes little bubbles on the top of the leaf. And so the leaf looks like it's covered in bumps or pimples, which is really not a good thing. And it also makes the leaf sick. And so it causes huge issues. So that's the only issue. Syzygiums, I think, have the better fruit, but they are very prone to psyllid. So you can look for a variety, if you're wanting to grow them in your garden, look for a variety that is more psyllid resistant. So do read your labels carefully. So resilience is one. It's also a smaller growing variety, so it's probably one of the better ones for urban growing, I think. But you can quite often find fantastic lily pillies as street trees and just harvest what you need. And I'm always hunting around, tasting, looking for the bigger fruits and the taste and the best tasting fruits. Luckily for me, there's a good one growing in my mum's garden. You can use these in a variety of ways. They've been used for many years to make syrups and preserves and jams and pickles. You can make wine from them, and they're good just added to salads or fruit salads. But do bear in mind, when you can see in that drink there, when it's been cut open, that in the bottom, in about the middle of the page at the bottom, you can see there's a seed in the center. So when you're chomping into them, be aware there's a hard seed in the middle, and just remove that if you're adding them to a salad or fruit salad. So generally I just cut them in half, take out the seed and throw them in the salad that way. They also freeze remarkably well, which is good to know. And they're good in cocktails because they absorb the alcohol, and then you get a little interesting bit at the end, a bit like watermelon. So that's a bit of fun. And they look really good. Native mint, yes, as mentioned there, is also really good in cocktails too. It gives a lot of flavour. So just a few bits and pieces that are, if you happen to have enrolled from a coastal area, then these are some things, or if you're going to coastal areas, you can look out for these. So coastal saltbush, if you go to fancy restaurants in Melbourne that are using bush foods, you'll most likely be eating this leaf because the chefs tend to forage for their saltbush. So beautiful silver foliage plant. It doesn't like overwatering, so not so great around the Yarra Ranges. As I said, I'm really including this for people who might be on the coast, or if you're going to the coast. So all along the coast of Victoria, you'll find this plant. And there's a whole variety of ways you can use those. You can shallow fry them like sage for a salty snack or garnish. You can just put them on top of pizza near the end of cooking to crisp them up. And also they're really good mixed into a sauerkraut or kimchi. They can get really, they can get much taller than 1.5 actually. I think it's good to try and keep them to 1.5, but they can be really messy and straggly. And so they do need a lot of pruning and controlling. This is the saltbush that I prefer for leaf use. So old man saltbush, and then I've also got a variety called de Kirk, which is a large leaf variety. But if you can't find that one for sale, small plug, I do have some for sale on my website. I think I've just started to sell plants. I think I've got them up there. Bulleen Nursery sometimes sells them as well. So they get to about 1.5 by 1.5. And as you can see, again, that beautiful silver foliage. I think these have a far superior taste compared to the coastal saltbush. But these are native to inland areas of Australia. So really hot, dry areas. Amazingly, I've been growing one in Melbourne. You can see on the far right picture, on the right-hand side picture, that's underneath a carob tree in my garden in Pascoe Vale South. And it's a bit straggly, but it grows there. It's been growing there for years in the shade of a tree. And I think what it likes is the dryness that the tree produces. And I just find this more palatable as a salad leaf. You can also deep fry these, the larger leaves, for chips. You can wrap them around, you know, prawns or tofu or meat, and then put them through skewers for cooking. So there's a whole range of ways you can use those. As I said, if you can't find that variety, look for a large leafed form generally. And now we'll just cover a couple of more unusual, a couple of special native plants. So lemon myrtle is really known as the queen of bush food plants or native food plants in Australia because it has, like, I'd have to say, kind of a heady aroma. It's a beautiful, beautiful scented plant. It only gets to, or you can keep it really easily to 1.5 or so meters high. And it's a very narrow plant. So if you have something that's 1.5 high, it'll only be about 50 centimeters up to 1 meter wide. And you can keep that in a pot for years and just keep on repotting it. In the ground, I've very rarely seen them above 3 meters high in Melbourne. I saw one not long ago that was maybe 4 or 5 meters high, but that was in a very shady position where it had been kind of pushed up by the lack of sunlight. In Melbourne, I strongly believe they do better in a semi-shaded position, although you do see people try them in full sun, but they always look yellow and not lush and green like mine look because I'm growing mine in the shade. I also believe they grow better in a pot in Melbourne. If you're going to plant them in the ground in Melbourne, I urge you to find large, which will also be expensive, plants. Bearing in mind that you need at least 1 leaf to make 1 cup of tea with boiling water, just crumble up the leaf. And when this workshop was done over the years in person, then I would have all these samples from my garden and you'd be smelling lemon myrtle while I'm speaking to you about it, which is a lovely experience, but you just have to imagine. The closest thing I can describe it to is it's like lemongrass. It's a really beautiful aroma. And you can in fact use it instead of lemongrass in curries, etc., or soups. My favourite way is just 1 leaf crumpled up, put it in a cup, add boiling water and just wait 3 minutes and drink it and inhale it in the meantime. It's really beautiful. But you can sprinkle dried ground leaves over jasmine rice. I love sprinkling it over fish. It's just the easiest thing in the world to put over fish fillets when you're cooking. And because of that because of the lemon aspect, you can use it in tagines instead of preserved lemon, and it does well in baking. There's actually really nothing that I can think of that lemon myrtle doesn't go with that well. It is a really, it's an amazingly adaptable plant. Of course, besides tea, you can also make cordial. It goes well blended with other lemony flavoured plants too. It's a fantastic thing. Oh, that's what I was mentioning. Because you need 1 leaf at a time for a cup of tea, you're going to need a biggish plant to be able to harvest. So if you're only putting in a little 150ml pot size plant that's only got 8 leaves on it, you can see that you're going to have to wait about 3 years before you can actually harvest much. So that's why I suggest to people, if you can find a bigger plant, it is worth it so you can harvest. Okay, so as I said, these are just random things that I found interesting in the native food sense. So desert lime, Citrus glauca, and this one is the only lime that I've found that is a bit more drought tolerant, which is a big thing because native finger limes and all the crosses of those are really water hungry, and if you're not messing around giving them the water that they need, then they just won't produce properly, and that's a bit disappointing. But the native lime is quite a lot hardier in that way. It's thornless, whereas the finger limes are incredibly thorny. It does prefer full sun, but I've had mine fruit in semi-shade, so that's quite good. The finger limes tend to fruit in Melbourne, or they vary, it depends on the variety you have, but the general finger limes fruit around March, April, that kind of period of time, or March, April, May. These fruit in summer. You can preserve them in salt. A friend of mine gave me some salted using the Stephanie Alexander recipe, and that was absolutely incredible, like such a good flavour, amazing flavour. You can also thinly slice these to garnish desserts, and they work really well that way because you've got the sweetness of the dessert and then you've got the tanginess of the fruit. So they're tiny little things, so you're not just eating large quantities of them, you're looking for ways to value add in a way. If you're a farmer, you'd call it value adding, but you're looking to get as much value out of them as possible. So you don't just gulp them down, you find ways of treasuring them, I suppose. So it's really well worth looking out for. And that same friend who gave me them preserved in salt had one plant in a pot, in quite a nice big pot, like a 50 centimetre size pot, and she had a reasonably established plant, but she got about 50 fruit off it, so it was lovely. And finger limes that we were talking about, these are some other finger limes. So the top one is just a straight finger lime, but of course then you've got green on the outside, you've got pink finger limes, red finger limes. This is a pink finger lime, or yellow as well, and you can see that they really are the shape and size of a finger, so hence why they get called finger limes. And you can see the very small leaves there. The bottom plant is sunset lime, so that, as you can see, is related to a kumquat, and it tastes quite a lot like a kumquat when you cut it open, actually. So it's more the parentage that tells you it's a finger lime. But if you want something to really experience that unusual citrus caviar taste inside that you can see in that top picture, that's the vesicles from the finger lime, then get yourself more of a straight finger lime rather than a cross. They can be grown in the ground in a protected position. I think that they prefer only morning up to midday sun. I don't think that they really like, I've never had one grow well in afternoon sun. I don't think they really like that. They're rainforest plants, so they do like a bit more protection. As I said before, at some stage they need a lot of water, and they do need to be fed at least 3 times. Results, you're probably feeding every couple of months or even every month if you want to, some sort of food. They unfortunately still do need protection from the citrus gall wasp, which is actually a native Australian pest, and it's a real pest. So they do need protection from that, and there's a whole variety of ways you can go about that. If anyone's actually really stuck with citrus gall wasp, I do have a couple of, I don't have one or two. I think I have maybe mainly one video on my YouTube, Karen Sutherland YouTube channel, and that does outline how I cope with citrus gall wasp, and it's a good 10-minute conversation. So I made the video essentially so that I didn't have to keep on repeating it to people because they'd all ask the same question. I thought, well, then that's there and anyone can look it up if they want to. So I don't think it's great, the citrus lime put into a drink. Some people swear by having it in a gin and tonic, but I'm not that keen on having a drink like that and then chewing up the garnish, and it's very chewy. So I prefer it with food. So I like it over fish, or tossed through salads or over the top of desserts. And that sunset lime at the bottom, you can tend to slice that more because it doesn't have the vesicles as much, or it doesn't really have the same vesicles, and so it becomes a really nice thin slice very easily. And here's showing another one of this is one of my favourite crosses, which is red centre is what it gets called. I tend to call it red centre. It also gets called Australian blood lime, so it's a beautiful colour inside and out, as you can see. And then I've just listed some of the other finger limes, and Nursery is definitely the place to go to for many varieties, because they have some very enthusiastic plant breeder who grows for them, and I think he grows at least 40 different cultivars and then grafts them for them. So the grafted are more expensive, and the seedling grown finger limes are much, much, much cheaper, but you can't get these unusual crosses like red centre and things like that. You can't get those unless you have a grafted variety. So there's many, many varieties to look for. So that's all a lot of fun to consider. And this is probably one of, well, besides finger limes, because finger limes, if you give them water and food, are quite easy. But midgeonberries are not native to Victoria. They're native to Queensland and New South Wales, I want to say, I think. So this is my front garden in Pascoe Vale South, and you can see the midgeonberries in the middle there, that feathery foliage. And I've got a couple of different forms in there, a broader leaf and a finer leaf, and you know, the fruit all taste the same. And the beautiful prolific fruit at the top with the long fine leaves was brought at a garden workshop. So I did a similar workshop to this, and a lady came along with a big bunch of this to show people how prolific they can be. And I'd never managed to get mine as prolific as that, so that was a really good learning. I mean, I love doing these sorts of workshops, especially those more interactive ones where you're in person, because people would be swapping information about, well, I've tried this and I've done this and that did really well. And so there was a lot of good information sharing. And so a lot of the information I bring to you comes from either experimenting, or some of it comes from, like that lady telling me, well, all I did was, you know, prune more and water more. Well, that's just really simple, but I just wasn't doing it. So you know, I was just planting them, and you know, well, they're doing their thing, and they'll fruit, which they did, and they still fruit quite a bit, even with, you know, very little care. So that's why it's worth trying out, giving them more care, like you would a regular fruiting plant or a regular productive plant in your garden. So if you prune them regularly and keep them really bushy, and if you water them regularly and feed them regularly, you'll be rewarded with a lot more fruit. So these are about the size, of a very small blueberry, and some people say they taste like blueberries. I have a bit of a hard time identifying what they taste of. They've got slight notes of eucalyptus, which sounds weird, but it's okay. They're okay. Then you've got also a cinnamony flavour as well. So they really are an unusual flavour profile that you can't get anywhere else. One point at the bottom there is to remember that even if you've got them in pots, try and have a big pot and have two plants together, because they like to have friends, and they're all still the same species, but they just produce more fruit when they are grown in groups. And that's the same with blueberries and things like that. If you've got all the same variety, if you've got all the one variety, you need to try to have, you know, 3 or so plants. And yeah, they do like shade, so they are a good understory plant. And they can sometimes arch over, and then when they hit the ground, grow roots and continue on that way. But if you're pruning them regularly to get more fruit, you won't have that happening. Oh, and they can be frozen as well, and they produce over a long period. So good for school gardens. They'd make a really good hedge. I haven't used them as a hedge, but they'd make a really good little productive hedge. And coastal currant is something that, if you're going to the coast, that's the very first slide I showed of me enjoying some of these in Tasmania, actually, that was. But you will find these on the coast in Victoria as well, and they're really delicious little white fruit. And the plants are covered in them. This one doesn't show as many, it's just the time of year I took the photo. But they, like I tried to grow one in a pot in a shady spot, and it really didn't like that. But then, I mean, as a gardener, I knew that something that really prefers or tolerates full exposure to sun and wind is not going to tolerate any kind of shade or protection. So if you're trying to grow it in your garden, then put it out in a very exposed sunny spot where it gets good light. But yeah, they are ripe when they're white, and they come off really easily too, and that's a good way of knowing when something's ready. And a lot of fruit are like that, native and non-native, that they're ripe when you touch them, they fall off. So they tell you they're ripe. And Here's another really delicious coastal plant. Now, you don't get this, well, depends where you're going in Victoria. I shouldn't say that because I don't spend much time on the coast of Victoria. I spend more time, or in the past, I've spent more time on the coast in Tasmania. So this is where I've tasted these. So this actually, there's a little mistake. I've just had this plant identified in the large picture. That is actually Carpobrotus glaucescens, for any botanist out there thinking she's got the wrong picture. You're right. I believe you can eat the fruit of glaucescens, but I believe you can. But the main one, because I've been doing a lot more investigating, a lot more reading and checking with some experts, so with some botanist type people about uses of Carpobrotus. And this picture of the fruit is Carpobrotus rossii, also called coastal raspberry, and it's native to coastal areas of Victoria, not inland, even though there are some that say it is, but I've pretty much confirmed now that it's not, and that's not me knowing that, this is me just looking it up and asking people that are expert in this field. And glaucescens, this was on the coast as well, but that one's in southern New South Wales. So I'm pretty sure that has an edible fruit as well. They didn't have fruit at the time. So you can also use the leaves. If you soak the leaves in cold water for half an hour and you remove some of the stronger flavours that you don't want, and then you can add them to stir fries. So that's just sort of leaching out some of the things you don't want, which you can do with warrigal greens as well, which I haven't included. I don't think I've included it in today's lecture or today's talk. They're really good for trying to stop insect bites. So if you break them open and rub the sticky stuff over your insect bite, it's really good to prevent itching. So it's a good plant for school gardens as well for that reason. And you can just nibble on the leaves as well, but they are quite strong. Yeah, they spread to about 1.5 metre wide. You can try growing them in a hanging basket as well for a bit of fun. And lemon aspen and white aspen, a little bit similar. They get to about 2 to 3 metres high in Melbourne, and these are not that commonly grown. You can buy them, but they're not commonly grown, so therefore it's hard to say with certainty how big they're going to grow. Mine did really well with morning sun, and now I've planted that plant that was in a pot there that you see in the shade in my garden, and it's got little fruit on it at the moment. As you can see there from the second last point, they need more than 600 millimetres of water a year. So I didn't think mine was going to fruit in the ground, but it's fruiting, I believe, because it's been a really wet year this year. So that's really fun, but it may not fruit every year. So it's more reliable to grow it in a pot. So now these have a really eucalyptusy flavour and aroma. So they're quite unusual. So they're more of a flavouring or a spice than they are a fruit just to nibble on. They're quite surprising when you first eat them. So they look all lovely and luscious, but they're fairly full on fruit. So I can't really advise you how to use them. I bought some jam once that I threw out, to be honest. I really didn't. That may sound terrible, but I really couldn't figure out anything to do with it. So macadamia, I thought I'd just throw this in because I've been experimenting with trying to grow them, and there certainly are cold tolerant hybrids sold for growth in Victoria, and these are ones I've planted. These pictures are plants I've put in for other people. I've got one in my garden. I've now kind of gradually found out from a friend of mine that they actually prefer, like the midgeonberries, to be with their friends. So you need more than one macadamia to get many nuts. And in fact, my one I hardly get any nuts from, and that's because I've only got one. I now know that's probably because I've only got one fruit, only one plant. And the other people I put them in for, I put in 2, and they get a reasonable amount of fruit. They don't get anything near commercial production. So I can't tell you the exact reason for that. I think it's probably something to do with the fact that, yes, these will grow in Melbourne, but they're probably not, or they're cold tolerant, but they're not necessarily prolific in Melbourne, or I don't know if anyone's actually got a good variety that is super prolific down here. So, and I've been growing one at my parents' place in the middle of Victoria, northeast of Shepparton, for years, that I grew from a cutting when I was an apprentice at Melbourne Zoo. And it produce, I mean, I don't give it all the proper feed. It just kind of grows there in the little orchard area, but it doesn't get as much as it's meant to. And they do need very specialised fertiliser, definitely low phosphorus, but they do get given a big regime of fertilisers in commercial production. And I've never, I have to say, treated them that well. And so maybe that's why they're not being super productive. So in other words, in the wild or just grown in the garden, they fruit a little bit. But they, oh yeah, that's the other point too. I thought they might grow in shade because the one I took the cutting from at the Melbourne Zoo years ago was in full shade and fruited, but every one I've planted since then has fruited better in the sun, even afternoon sun. So I've established that you need more than one, and that you definitely need to buy the cold tolerant hybrids they're selling specifically for Victoria, such as those ones there, but you also need to give them sun. And then if you experiment with you also should try and choose varieties that are specifically smaller, because some can get quite massive. If you go to Burnley College Garden, you'll see a very large macadamia tree there that's very old. And then as we're coming up to our question time, I thought it was a good time to point out where you might try and buy some of these plants. So of course, you're not going to find macadamias at the Indigenous nurseries, but you will find them at Kuranga Native Nursery, Bulleen Art and Garden Centre, and Ceres Bushfood Nursery. So Kuranga, of course, is out your direction, but if you can't get things there, I mean, that's a fantastic nursery. So you can get most things there that you would need, but I put the other two in because I don't know where people are signing up from today. So Knox Environment Society, I haven't actually bought from them. I have bought from Candlebark before. I haven't bought, and as I said, VINC is my main one I buy from. And I've got had some unusual things from Candlebark over the years. I've bought lots of things from Kuranga, Bulleen and Ceres, and I've never bought from South Dandenong Community Nursery. I think I used to be a member of Karwarra years ago. I visited that nursery, that garden. It's a really interesting garden. So that's a great place to see some of these plants in a garden setting and learn about them. So look up your local Indigenous nurseries. And also those are good quality native plant nurseries too that have a lot of bush foods. And of course Kuranga has a bush food cafe as well, so it's a lot of fun. And one book I'd like to really recommend to you is from Jamie Simpson. And apparently Barb was telling me recently that he has actually given a talk for you, so for your area before. So if you get to see him again, he's a terrific, really knowledgeable guy. And his book that he self-published that I have, and it's great, Bush Foods and Survival Plants of Southeast Australia. And he has learned for many, many years from local Indigenous people, and he, with their blessing, passes that knowledge on. So he a lot more than me, passes on Indigenous information, and partly that's so it doesn't get lost. And as I said, he's been sanctioned to do so. And Julie Weatherhead of Pemmant Ridge Farm, that's a family business that even though I've met Julie and I've been following her work for years and love what she does, and her book is absolutely gorgeous. There's a lot of information in that book. I still haven't visited this place, but I must get there one day. And friends I know who've been there say it's just a really fantastic visit, fantastic place to go. She does cookery classes, they have a little cafe, and there's accommodation there as well. And you've got gardens there to look at as well. And I think they sell plants too. And then you've also got Mark Oliver's book. And I have to say that some of my first forays into bush food planting and experimenting was through reading Mark Oliver's book, A Taste of Australia, Outback Cafe. So there's a little, I think we finished exactly on time, Barb. That's a bit of a shock.
We did, Karen. Thanks for that. I just actually wanted to add a couple of things on your references there.
Thank you.
I have visited Julie's garden. I have taken a few bus tours in my other line of work out there with the active aging team. So we have done a garden tour, and it is definitely worthwhile if anyone gets a chance, and if they are open again, to visit Julie and her husband. And yeah, and she does sell the book out there as well. And we had a beautiful afternoon tea there, so it's very interesting. And yes, Jamie Simpson, yeah, we've had him a couple of times through Knox. Great, lot of knowledge. And definitely the Knox Environment Society, they do have a lot of plants for sale. So I would recommend to anybody, it's one of our Knox's Indigenous nurseries here just down near the Ferntree Gully Library. So do have a visit, and lots of seedlings and things to buy there.
Actually, one thing about Indigenous nurseries I forgot to say before was that usually all Indigenous nurseries have lots of leaflets to give away, like lots of free information for people who maybe aren't in a position to buy books. So you can pick up lots of leaflets for bird attracting or for native food use, native food uses. And so they're a really good resource generally. They're very knowledgeable people usually.
They are, and the one that we have here in Ferntree Gully, they have planted along the bike track, so there are a lot to actually see what they've got there. So I might just go back. We've got a lot of questions, so we better go go through these as much as we can before we finish up. Okay, so I'll just go back to the beginning. Now, back to your native mint. How do you make your tea?
So yeah, I didn't mention that. That's right. Native, the lemon myrtle, it's 1 or 2 leaves per cup. The native mint, it's about the same. So generally for all herbal teas, it's about a teaspoon of fresh or dried leaves. And so, if you crunch up that native mint, and crunching up the leaves of any herb releases the essential oils and the components you're trying to release into the water. So, pick a good 1 or 2 sprigs, scrunch it up, put it in the pot or the cup and pour the boiling water over, and then just let it sit for a bit.
Okay, thank you. Now, thyme in your garden, how can you tell if it's the edible variety if you've lost the name?
Yeah, tricky. A lot of people have asked that sort of question. If you're not sure, you need to really take some sprigs to a local Indigenous nursery or to a retail, retail nurseries might not be as keen identifying plants that they didn't sell you. They are a little bit busy at the moment, post-COVID. So I'd maybe try a garden club, or you have to have it identified for you. It won't kill you if you, not as far as I know, it won't do anything terrible to you, but it will just be so strong that you just don't want to eat it. So because there's Prostanthera mellissifolia, there's ovalifolia, and they look so similar. So the first point is that the 2 that are edible have purple flowers. So if it has a pink flower or a white flower, forget it. There's a big, tall Prostanthera lasianthus that grows out your way, and that is not one of the edibles. So you have to speak to someone else to find out, for you. So, or you can keep, to identify it from a book is really difficult.
Yes. Okay. Is appleberry suitable for a pot?
Yes, I've been growing one in a pot for a while just to see what it's going to do. And yeah, it doesn't seem to mind confined spaces at all.
Okay. Now, the kangaroo apple, how do you use it in cooking?
I have never cooked with it. I've just eaten it off the plant. So you'd have to really Google that one, or one of those. Probably just Google this day and age.
Yeah.
So sorry, I haven't tried that.
That's okay. I haven't either. I've eaten them from the bush as well.
Yeah, they're nice that way.
Can you also eat the leaves of saltbush?
All saltbush leaves are, all the ones I've mentioned today have edible leaves, but the ones that are grown for their berries, I don't find the leaves very palatable, and they are very strong. And also I would say that I would only use the tips, like right at the end of the branches. That's what I've been taught to do in what I've learned from an Indigenous woman that I learned from, Min Maya. And they're very medicinal. So I didn't bother including that because, but I'm allowed to share that, but I just didn't bother because we weren't talking about that. So they're edible, but they're just not very tasty. So that's why I included the coastal saltbush and the old man saltbush are the ones that I suggest, from what I've tried, have the tastiest leaves for salad leaves. So, and as I said, the old man saltbush is tastier than the coastal saltbush. That's why I recommended them, because I find them the best ones.
Okay. Now, I think this is to do with the flax. The Tasmania is poisonous, or is it just not tasty?
I can't remember. I think it's, I honestly can't remember. And just don't eat it.
Okay.
Sometimes people don't like that answer. They want to know exactly why. And I mean, sometimes I haven't, because I'm not a scientist, I haven't gone into the full reasons why it's not eaten, but it is definitely, I mean, a lot of cultural and traditional things. The same with, native European elderberry. It was never eaten fresh, and then I found out years later, well, that's because it's poisonous when it's eaten fresh. So, a lot of traditions and things that you're told, well, you just don't eat that. It's good to listen. So I'm listening to someone else who's told me, and I was told, don't eat Dinella tasmanica, so I don't eat it.
Right.
But look, you can look it up. There's that much on Google now that you could easily research that and probably find out what particular component is not good in it. But yeah, I just wouldn't eat it.
Okay. What is the leaf base of the mat rush?
Oh, so the leaf base is, plucking out the leaf, and the base is right down in the center of the plant. So it's literally the base of the leaf. So you've got the tip of the leaf, which is right out there. Mm-hmm. And then if I was a leaf, then you're looking right back here as I'm joined to the plant.
Right.
So when you pull that out, it's white and soft and very tasty.
Okay, now are native bluebells sometimes pink, or are they always blue?
I think they're always blue. Yeah, and look, there could be, Kuranga Nursery has some amazing variations in plants. Mm-hmm. So they could have something pink, but I'd be very careful, unless if you're finding something in the wild and you're not 100% sure what it is, I would not be eating it. That's why I recommend, especially when you're starting, to buy things from a nursery. You know what it is, it's got its name, and then you can reference that. It's much, much, much safer than foraging in the bush unless you have a guide.
Great. Okay. Now another hanging basket. Can native bluebells be grown in hanging baskets?
I think that would be really lovely. I think that's a great idea. Yeah, because they are floppy. So yeah, I think that would be really pretty.
Okay. Now I'm just going. Look, we've got some more. How long does it take for a finger lime plant to start producing fruit?
Oh, that's a good point. So about 3 years, but it depends what size you buy it from. So if you buy it really tiny, say, maybe 30 centimeters tall, it might take 4 years. But if you buy them a little bit bigger, then about 3 years, yeah. And as I said, you must water and you must feed. And if they're in a pot, mine wasn't producing, and I put it in a much, much bigger pot, and not straight away, like as it gets bigger. That's another whole conversation, not to over pot, as it's called, which means you're putting things into too big a pot too quickly, because you end up with a bad root ball. So a root ball that falls apart. So you're kind of breaking nursery rules that way, and you pay for it later. So yeah, about 3 years, and there doesn't seem to be any advantage to the grafted varieties over the seedling as far as quick speed of fruiting, which is good because the grafted ones are so much more expensive.
Okay, so there's a comment here, Peppermint Ridge are open again, and I do know that they do sell finger limes, so which is good to know. Now, kangaroo grass, can seeds be used to make bread?
Yes, because there's people doing it. Bruce Pascoe's doing it, and it's been done for thousands of years. But I don't know how to get the seeds out of the seed head, and that's the crucial question. So it was something that was done years ago, and the seeds. I've got a photo of a kangaroo grass seed on my thumbnail, and it wasn't even as wide as the white. Hang on a minute, that's probably a slightly grubby white bit of my nail, gardener's hand, but it wasn't even as wide as that. Very, very thin, tiny seed. So that's going to be tricky. A lot of patience, or a particular method that I don't have.
Right. Okay. Warrigal greens, are they okay to eat? Have heard they have oxalic acid. I've actually grown wariegal greens and eaten them. I did buy them from Peppermint Ridge. And Julie did talk about the oxalic acid. I think that there isn't...
They are very high in oxalic acid, so there's a really simple way of dealing with that. And I don't know why I didn't add that to this list, which is, I sometimes forget wariegal greens because they're so easy. They're easy to grow. I should have, in other words, I apologise, I should have had them in this list. They're super easy to grow. They're an annual. So once you get them growing, and you can grow them from seed, and once you get them growing, they will often self-seed. And so they'll come back again and again in your garden. They don't mind growing in the shade. They are really good as a big, nice native, a big, nice ground cover that acts as a living mulch. And the simplest way to treat them for cooking is you soak them in cold water for half an hour, just like the pig face or coastal raspberry leaves, and then you drain that and use it, or use them fresh, or you can blanch them in boiling water for 15 to 30 seconds and then take them out and then discard that water. Always discard the soaking or blanching water, and then because that's taken out the bits you don't want, and then you can use them in cooking. So yeah, no, they're super easy to use, and like I said, that should have been in this list really.
Yeah, I use them in stir fries mainly.
Perfect. Yeah, but you are better to blanch them first. Because and the cold water treatment is just so that you have them nice and crispy for salads, and the blanching gets them ready for cooking. So
yeah.
I
have a species of kangaroo apple which no birds eat when ripe. So are all kangaroo apples edible?
Well, I don't know what it is. I mean, you'd have to have it identified. You know, I don't know what the plant is. I'm sorry. Yeah, so it's really hard to say. Again, you could take it to your local Indigenous nursery. If you don't have flower and fruit on the plant at the moment, if you've got photos of the flower and the fruit, because botanical identification is primarily through the flower, but also the leaf shape's important. So take as much plant material as you can to the nursery, or otherwise really high resolution photos, and they can hopefully identify it for you.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple of questions regarding identifying native bushes. So probably the best option is to take them part of the plant into the nursery.
Yeah,
it's hard to tell from an explanation.
It is, and I still have trouble as well. I mean, one really good reference book, but they are very expensive to buy, but you can find them in libraries, is Elliott and Jones, Encyclopedia of Australian Native Plants in Cultivation, I think it is. So there's, how many volumes are there? There might be 10, I forget now. I mean, the last one I bought was over $300. So, but they're A to Z. So you've got, a couple of letters A to CA, covered in the first one, and then it goes on from there. So that has really good detailed descriptions, and that's a way of figuring out what you're looking at. But, that was a big investment for me, and I work as a gardener. So, and in all different things I do, teaching, writing, things like that, designing. So I need to be able to look that up, and I've used it quite a bit recently when I was trying to learn about these carbobroters. So I was looking it all up and going, that's what's going on, right? I get it. But I don't use it that often. I don't use that volume very often, but for me, I just have to have it there. For someone else, they could take all their photos and of their plants and then take it to the library and look up the appropriate volume. And that's probably the best reference book I can say that's able to be used by the general public. I think there is a plant identification service at the Melbourne Herbarium, but they do charge you for it at the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne.
Okay. What food do you recommend for midgeon berries?
Any of the rainforest Australian natives I find respond to regular plant food. They don't need special native plant food. They are okay with general all-purpose garden food. So I tend to use a lot of compost and homemade compost and homemade garden mulch. So lots of leaf matter going into the ground, which is a nice form of gentle feeding. But I also once a year give pelletized manure, but I use a brand that has pelletized manure plus seaweed plus rock dust and a whole lot of other little goodies like that in it, and I like to use that. And I throw that around once a year. So I'm not a really heavy feeder. If you wanted to feed more, well, I probably could just use that more often, but organic if possible, and that one I use is organic. So because you're trying to build up the soil microbes and make the plant healthy and not kill your microorganisms and your worms and things like that. So there's a whole range of good things available now, but they don't need native specific food. No, so that's okay.
Okay.
And that's midgeonberries there, by the way, in that picture. That last picture.
Oh, okay. Just before we go on, I am the session has been recorded, so I will be sharing that. I'll be sharing that with everybody as well, just in case you're all wondering. Do you know, Karen, where anyone can go to taste and see some of these Indigenous plants? Do you know if there's?
They do have. I don't think it's as much tasting, but they do have bushfood garden tours at the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. They have been First Nations people working as guides there, because they had a little group from the Melbourne Botanic, from those guys, and some of the other nursery people came and had a little tour of my garden a long time ago. So I know that they do that, because I've been meaning to go back and have a little visit with them. And of course, Julie Weatherhead. I used to have tours of my garden with tastings, but I can't anymore, or not at the moment. And who else does that? Kuranga might. I don't know. Kuranga Nursery might.
Yeah, I think they just sell them. I'm not sure about tasting and tours.
Look, that's one reason I used to do tastings, because I found that people didn't have access to that, and so it was a really nice thing to say. I've really enjoyed doing it over the years. So this class would have been a tasting in different times, and a smelling, because so many of them have a good aroma. So yeah, I know it's a slow journey to plant something and wait 3 years to taste it. So who else would have them? Not
anyone else.
Yeah, and probably just going to Indigenous nurseries and joining the friends of that group or something like that. So yeah.
What's your all-purpose plant food called?
I wasn't sure if I was meant to mention brands. So I use Grow Better, and so it's just one that I've found available, and so at least when I mention it, it's available, that people can buy it all over the place. And it just has a nice blend. It's not just like Dynamic Lifter and those sort of, and Rooster Burster, they're just chicken manure quite often, or they used to be, and it's too strong in the it's not balanced, and so that's why I like the Grow Better one, because it's got the seaweed and the rock dust, and I think there's some other things as well. So yeah, I really like that. And look, it seems to work really well. And as I said, just lots of homemade mulch, which is leaf and bark chippings from pruning in the garden, and just throw it all around. And that, that plus I put gypsum on once a year because of the clay soil. And I'm a really low input type of gardener, and so that's a bit why I might not get as much fruit from, you could push it along a bit more. The other thing I like to use is sea salt occasionally, because sea salt it's more of a trace element, but it does boost the plant's cell wall thickness and more resistance to disease. But I don't use it very often. I use it more in the pots, to be honest. And along with that, you can buy something called Power Feed, and that's sea salt mixed with fish emulsion. And you can buy the fish stuff separately, or you can buy it mixed. And the other really good thing is, of course, your own homemade compost, although of course that varies in its quality according to what you put into it. So if you have a diet that's really varied, then your compost is going to be really varied, and you put your homemade chicken, your stuff from your chicken cage in there, as chicken coop, nesting boxes and stuff like that goes in there as well, then it's got higher nutrient levels in it. So yeah, it does depend on what you're putting in, but you can sometimes get from food swaps and things, if there's any still going, but the worm leachate from worm farms, worm farm and worm leachate and worm tea is really highly nutritious stuff. So, but there's a whole range of different, I think there was was it This Organic Garden or the last one, there was a really good article on making your own homemade fertilizers, which is stuff I've been meaning to look up for ages, and Penny Woodward and Leonie Shanahan wrote it, and it was all about which particular, comfrey tea, what that actually gives your plants. And it was really good, because I thought, I've got to remember to copy that and, cut it out and keep it, so that I keep that as a reference when you're thinking, well, oh, I've got comfrey, or I've got dandelion leaves, or I've got whatever, and what can I, especially for people who are not wanting to spend a huge amount of money, because that can be the expensive part of gardening, is buying all the stuff. So if you can make some things yourselves, that can be really good. So yeah, look up that article in your local library, or you can look up recipes online for homemade fertilizers too, and they can be really good.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Someone asked about an app. I actually do use an app myself when I'm walking around our streets and I see a plant that I like. I use my app to identify it. I'll share that with everybody tomorrow when I send out the link. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying I just use this. It is a free app. Do you use an app, Karen?
No, I don't. No, because if I ask other plant friends, so yeah, between us, I mean, I get sent things to identify from other people, and so there's a group of people, other professionals that I know, and we just tend to ask each other, if it's a problem that, so.
I mean, I probably wouldn't use this app to identify if it's an edible or not, but for me, I normally just take a photo and think, oh, that looks nice. I might just look that up and.
Yeah, to be honest, I would only use an app. I would only recommend an app as a launching off point, and then I would say, and I would definitely not identify just from the internet either. I have seen some appalling information on plants, even on bush food uses like coastal wattle. 3 different references online saying yes, you can eat the pods of this uncooked or cooked, of that particular species, and you really couldn't. It was really ghastly. That's not one we included today, obviously, but yeah, you definitely shouldn't be just trusting information of the internet. The whole point about books, and having gone through the experience of one book myself with the book on tomatoes that the 3 of us did, I found that, there's a reason why books take so much effort and so much work, and that's because everything is checked and checked and checked thoroughly. And so you can, if it's a good writer, and with a good if the reputation of your writers are good, then you can trust the information. And like when you're trying to look up when I teach classes on herbal teas or things like that, I always say, look up 3 references, cross-reference. I don't just look up one book for anything. I tend to look up up to 3 references to confirm what you do is something that I'm not sure about. So you can't be too careful, really.
No, that's right. So I think we're probably out of time. You've got a Facebook page, Karen, if anyone has any other.
I didn't put that up, but I've got Facebook and Instagram and as Edible Eden Design, and I've got YouTube as Karen Sutherland.
I did put your YouTube link up and your website, so everyone should have that. So if there's any other questions, you're happy for them to send it through to you on your Facebook?
Yes, yeah.
That would be great. As I said, I'll send out a link to the presentation. It was really informative. Thank you so much, Karen.
Oh, good. It's hard to kind of balance between too much and not enough.
Well, it's never too much. But I'm sure we can maybe do something again next year when we come into the new year to learn.
I'd look forward to it. Hopefully it takes a lot less. Barb and I planned this workshop many months ago.
We did, and we got there in the end.
Yay!
But definitely everyone check out the Knox Environment Society. There are lots of plants there. There's lots to look at as well. As you mentioned, Peppermint Ridge Farm, Kuranga Nursery. I do know that they have. I'm pretty sure they have the midgeon berries. I think.
Oh, if they're available, they would. It's just they've been getting bought out as people start to realise what midgeon berries are.
So thanks for everyone for coming, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks again, Karen.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck with all your native food sampling and growing.
Thanks.
Now, Barb, do you want me to stay till everyone